The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty ranch as Jake Martinez adjusted his worn cowboy hat and
We have to
prepared for
leave.
another day
Now.
of herding cattle.
But they'll
At
find us.
28, he
Not
had
if we
worked
ride
the
now,
same
trust me.
land for over
Okay.
a decade,
Let's go.
following in his father's footsteps as a ranch hand on the sprawling Thompson estate in rural Texas. His calloused hands told the story of countless hours spent mending fences, breaking horses, and driving cattle across the vast plains that stretched as far as the eye could see. Jake never expected his life to change on that particular Tuesday in March, but fate had other plans waiting for him just beyond the horizon. The trouble began when Old Man Thompson called him into the main house, something that rarely happened unless there was serious business to discuss. Jake knocked on the heavy wooden door, his boots still carrying traces of the morning's work. Thompson's weathered face appeared in the doorway, and Jake immediately noticed the worry lines that seemed deeper than usual. "Come in, son," Thompson said, his voice carrying a weight that made Jake's stomach tighten with concern. Inside the modest living room, Jake saw a woman he didn't recognize sitting on the edge of the old leather couch. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and clothes that looked like they had seen better days. What struck Jake most were her eyes. They held a mixture of fear and determination that reminded him of a cornered animal ready to fight for survival. "Jake, this here is Maria," Thompson said, gesturing toward the woman. "She's in a heap of trouble, and I reckon you might be the only one who can help her." Maria looked up at Jake with those same intense eyes, and he felt something shift inside his chest. She was beautiful, but more than that, she carried herself with a dignity that seemed unbreakable, despite whatever circumstances had brought her to their doorstep. "What kind of trouble?" Jake asked, removing his hat and holding it respectfully in his hands. Thompson cleared his throat and walked to the window, gazing out at the fields where cattle grazed peacefully. "Maria here escaped from something terrible, Jake. There are men who think they own her, men who bought her like she was livestock to be traded and sold." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. In all his years on the ranch, he had heard whispers of such things happening, in the darker corners of their world, but he had never come face to face with the reality of it. The idea that someone could treat another human being as property made his blood boil with a righteous anger he had never felt before. Maria spoke for the first time, her voice soft but steady. "They will come looking for me. I know they will. I cannot stay here and bring danger to Mr. Thompson or his family." Jake looked between Thompson and Maria, understanding beginning to dawn on him. "You want me to help her get somewhere safe?" "More than that," Thompson said, turning back from the window. "I want you to take her far from here, somewhere those men will never think to look. I know you've got family up in Colorado, near those mountains where a person could disappear if they needed to." Jake's mind raced as he considered what Thompson was asking of him. It would mean leaving the only life he had ever known, abandoning the ranch that had been his world since childhood. But as he looked at Maria again, seeing the hope that flickered in her eyes despite her obvious fear, he knew there was really only one answer he could give. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Not long," Maria whispered. "They discovered I was missing yesterday morning. They have connections everywhere, people who help them track down girls who try to run." Jake felt his jaw clench as anger surged through him again. The idea that such a network existed, that there were people who made their living hunting down vulnerable women, made him want to ride out and confront these men directly. But he knew that approach would likely get them all killed and accomplish nothing. "There's something else you need to know," Thompson continued. "These aren't just common criminals, Jake. The man who thinks he owns Maria has connections to some powerful people in this state. Local law enforcement won't be much help, and some of them might even be working for him." The gravity of the situation settled on Jake's shoulders like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about helping one woman escape a bad situation. This was about taking on an entire system of corruption and human trafficking that reached into places he had never imagined. Maria stood up from the couch, her movements graceful despite the obvious tension in her body. "I understand if you cannot help me. This is not your fight, and I will not ask you to risk everything for a stranger." But as Jake looked at her, he realized she wasn't a stranger anymore. Something had changed the moment he saw her sitting in that living room. Something that went beyond simple compassion or moral duty. He couldn't name it yet, but he knew with absolute certainty that he would not let these men take her back to whatever hell she had escaped from. "Ma'am," Jake said, his voice steady and sure, I made a promise to myself a long time ago that I would never stand by and watch innocent people get hurt if there was something I could do about it. You're not asking me to risk everything for a stranger. You're giving me the chance to do what's right." Thompson nodded approvingly, but his expression remained grim. "You'll need to leave tonight under cover of darkness. I can give you supplies and my best horses, but after that, you'll be on your own." Jake spent the rest of the day making preparations while Maria stayed hidden in the main house. He gathered supplies for a long journey, including food, water, camping gear, and his father's old rifle that he had inherited when the man passed away 5 years earlier. Every item he packed felt significant, like he was preparing for a journey that would change everything about his life. As evening approached, Jake found himself thinking about the choice he was making. He had lived a simple life on the ranch, content with honest work and the satisfaction of a job well done. Now he was about to embark on something that felt like an adventure from one of the dime novels he occasionally read by lamplight in his small cabin. But this wasn't fiction. This was real. And the stakes couldn't be higher. Maria's life hung in the balance, and Jake had appointed himself her protector. The weight of that responsibility both terrified and energized him. When darkness finally fell, Jake led 2 horses to the back of the main house where Maria was waiting with a small bundle of belongings. She had changed into clothes that Thompson's wife had provided, practical riding attire that would serve her better on the trail than the dress she had arrived in. "Are you ready?" Jake asked quietly. Maria nodded, but he could see the fear in her eyes despite her brave facade. "Where will we go?" "North first, then west toward Colorado," Jake replied. "I have an uncle who runs a small ranch in the mountains. He's a good man who won't ask too many questions, and the country up there is rough enough that it would be hard for anyone to track us." As they mounted their horses and prepared to ride into the unknown, Jake felt the weight of his decisions settling on his shoulders. Behind them lay everything familiar and safe. Ahead waited danger, uncertainty, and quite possibly death. But as Maria looked at him with gratitude shining in her dark eyes, Jake knew he had made the right choice. Whatever happened next, he would face it with the knowledge that he had stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for herself. The horses' hooves made soft sounds in the dirt as they rode away from the ranch, heading into a darkness that seemed both ominous and full of possibility. Jake had no way of knowing what challenges awaited them on the trail ahead, but he had made a promise to Maria, to Thompson, and to himself. He would see her safely to freedom, no matter what it cost him. 3 days into their journey, Jake and Maria had covered nearly 100 miles of rough country, staying off the main roads and following cattle trails that wound through dense forests and rocky terrain. The horses were holding up well, but both riders were beginning to feel the strain of constant vigilance and sleeping on the hard ground. They had spoken little during the long hours in the saddle, but Jake found himself learning about Maria through observation rather than conversation. She never complained about the discomfort or the pace he set. Even when he pushed them to ride from before dawn until well after sunset, she handled her horse with natural skill, and when they made camp each evening, she helped with the chores without being asked. On the morning of the 4th day, Jake's careful planning nearly came undone when they stumbled into danger from an unexpected direction. They were following a narrow trail through a grove of pine trees when Jake heard the unmistakable sound of horses approaching from behind. His blood turned cold as he realized what this might mean. Either they had been tracked down by Maria's pursuers, or they were about to encounter someone else who might recognize them and report their location. "Quick," Jake whispered urgently to Maria. "Into the trees." They guided their horses off the trail and behind a thick cluster of pines just as 3 men on horseback came into view. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as he got a clear look at the riders. These weren't the kind of men he had expected. They weren't dressed like ranch hands or bounty hunters. Instead, they wore the clothes of businessmen, with clean shirts and expensive hats that marked them as having money and influence. The man in the lead was older, perhaps in his 50s, with graying hair and cold eyes that seemed to take in every detail of their surroundings. Jake instinctively knew this was someone dangerous, the kind of man who was used to getting what he wanted through fear and intimidation. "She came this way," the leader said in a voice that carried clearly through the morning air. The tracker was certain of it. 3 days ahead of us, maybe 4. But we're gaining ground. "What if she's not alone anymore?" one of the other men asked. "Thompson might have sent someone with her." The leader's laugh was without humor. "Then whoever he sent will learn what happens to people who interfere with my business." I've invested too much money in that girl to let some cowboy with delusions of heroism cost me what's mine." Jake felt Maria tense beside him, and he reached out to place a steadying hand on her arm. The casual way these men talked about her as property made him want to step out from behind the trees and confront them directly, but he knew that would be suicide. 3 against 1 were impossible odds, especially when his most important job was keeping Maria safe. "Spread out," the leader commanded. "Check for signs that they left the trail. If they're trying to be clever and avoid the main roads, they'll have left tracks somewhere." Jake's mind raced as he watched the 3 men dismount and begin examining the ground around the trail. It would only be a matter of minutes before one of them spotted the hoofprints that led into the trees where he and Maria were hiding. They needed to move, and they needed to move fast. Motioning for Maria to follow, Jake began leading his horse deeper into the forest, moving as quietly as possible over the pine needles that carpeted the ground. Every step seemed to make too much noise, and he expected at any moment to hear shouts of discovery from behind them. They had managed to put perhaps 50 yards between themselves and the trail when Jake heard one of the men call out in triumph.
"Here! They left the trail right here. How long ago?"
The leader's voice demanded. "Hard to say for certain, but recent enough. We're close." Jake knew they were out of time. The men would follow their tracks through the trees, and it would be impossible to stay hidden much longer. But as he looked around desperately for options, he spotted something that might give them a chance. A rocky slope that led up toward a ridgeline about a quarter-mile ahead. If they could reach those rocks, their horses' hooves wouldn't leave tracks that could be followed. It was risky because they would be exposed while crossing open ground, but it might be their only opportunity to throw their pursuers off the trail. "Stay close," Jake whispered to Maria, "and be ready to run." She nodded, her face pale but determined. Jake could see that she understood the danger they were in, and he was impressed by her composure under pressure. They mounted their horses and began moving toward the rocky slope, still trying to stay concealed among the trees for as long as possible. Behind them, Jake could hear the 3 men crashing through the underbrush, following their trail with the persistence of bloodhounds. When they finally broke from the tree line and made a dash for the rocks, Jake held his breath, waiting for the shout that would mean they had been spotted. But luck was with them. The slope was steeper than it had appeared from a distance, and they were able to reach the rocky ground without being seen. Once they were on the rocks, Jake led Maria in a zigzag pattern that would make it difficult for anyone to determine which direction they had actually gone. The horses' hooves rang against the stone, but the sound echoed off the surrounding cliffs in a way that would make it hard to pinpoint their exact location. They spent 2 hours picking their way across the rocky terrain before Jake finally felt confident that they had lost their pursuers. When they descended back into forested country on the far side of the ridge, he allowed himself to believe that they might have escaped the immediate danger. But the encounter had changed everything. Jake now understood that they weren't just running from local criminals. They were being hunted by professionals with resources and connections that reached far beyond anything he had imagined. The leader's expensive clothes and confident manner suggested someone with serious money behind him. The kind of man who could afford to hire the best trackers and wasn't accustomed to being denied what he wanted. As they made camp that evening in a hidden valley miles from where they had encountered the 3 men, Maria finally broke the silence that had stretched between them since their narrow escape. "His name is Vincent Carlyle," she said quietly, as they sat by their small fire. "He owns businesses in 3 states, but his real money comes from buying and selling girls like me." Jake looked up from the coffee he was preparing, seeing something new in Maria's expression. The fear was still there, but it was accompanied by a steely determination that hadn't been present before. "He bought me from men who took me from my family's farm in Mexico," she continued. "My parents owed money to the wrong people, and when they couldn't pay, those men took me instead." The simple words carried a weight of pain that made Jake's chest tighten with sympathy and anger. He had grown up hearing stories about his grandfather's struggles as a young immigrant, but those tales seemed almost quaint compared to the brutal reality that Maria had lived through. "How long?" Jake asked gently. 2 years, Maria replied. 2 years of being moved from place to place, of men who thought they owned me because they had paid money for me. I tried to escape before, but they always found me. They said I would never be free, that I belonged to them forever. Jake stirred the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise into the dark sky. Well, they were wrong about that. You're free now, and you're going to stay that way. Maria looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You don't understand what kind of man Carlyle is. He has judges and sheriffs in his pocket. He has men who will hunt us across state lines if necessary. He will never stop looking for me. Then we'll have to make sure he never finds you," Jake said simply. The conversation fell silent again, but Jake could feel something had shifted between them. The shared danger had created a bond that went beyond the simple relationship between a protector and someone who needed protection. Maria was no longer just a victim he was trying to help. She was becoming someone he cared about deeply. Over the following days, as they continued their journey north toward Colorado, Jake found himself opening up to Maria in ways he had never opened up to anyone before. He told her about his childhood on the ranch, about his dreams of someday having his own spread where he could raise horses and cattle. She listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she understood the appeal of a life built around honest work and connection to the land. In return, Maria began sharing memories of her life before Carlisle and his men had destroyed everything she held dear. She told Jake about her family's small farm, about helping her mother tend a garden that provided vegetables for their table and flowers that made their modest home beautiful. She spoke of dreams she had harbored, of becoming a teacher, of using education to build a better life for herself and her family. As Jake listened to these stories, he began to understand that helping Maria escape was about more than just saving her from immediate danger. It was about giving her the chance to reclaim the life and dreams that had been stolen from her. But even as he felt himself growing closer to Maria, Jake couldn't shake the knowledge that Carlisle and his men were still out there somewhere, following their trail with patient determination. The encounter with the three riders had proven that their pursuers were professionals who wouldn't give up easily. Every night as he took his turn standing watch while Maria slept, Jake found himself scanning the darkness for signs of danger. Every sound in the forest made him reach for his rifle, and every distant horseman they spotted during their daylight travels made his heart race with the fear that they had been discovered again. The strain was beginning to tell on both of them, but Jake was determined to see their journey through to its conclusion. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it regardless of the cost. As they approached the border of Colorado, Jake knew they were entering the final phase of their escape. His uncle's ranch lay another 3 days ahead, hidden in mountain country that would provide natural protection against pursuit. If they could reach it safely, Maria would finally have the sanctuary she needed to start building a new life. But Jake also knew that Carlisle wouldn't give up just because they crossed a state line. The man had too much invested in Maria to simply write her off as a loss. Somehow, Jake was going to have to find a way to end this pursuit permanently, to ensure that Maria would never again have to look over her shoulder in fear. The answer to that problem still eluded him, but as they rode toward the mountains under a sky full of stars, Jake felt a growing conviction that he would find a way. He had to, because the alternative was unthinkable. The mountain air was thin and crisp as Jake and Maria finally approached his Uncle Samuel's ranch. Nestled in a valley surrounded by towering peaks that seemed to touch the clouds. After 9 days of hard riding and constant vigilance, the sight of the modest log cabin and wooden corrals filled Jake with a relief so profound he almost slumped in his saddle. Samuel Martinez emerged from the cabin as they rode up, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he recognized his nephew. At 62, Samuel was still a formidable man, with shoulders broad from decades of ranch work and eyes that missed nothing. He had been like a second father to Jake after his own father died, and Jake trusted him more than anyone else in the world. "Jake, boy!" Samuel called out, striding forward to help them dismount. "What brings you to my little corner of paradise? And who might this young lady be?" Jake quickly explained their situation, watching his uncle's expression grow more serious with each detail. Samuel listened without interruption, occasionally glancing at Maria with a mixture of sympathy and growing anger, as he began to understand what she had endured. "Well," Samuel said when Jake finished his story, "I reckon you've come to the right place. These mountains have been hiding folks who need hiding for longer than either of us has been alive. But if this Carlisle fellow is as determined as you say, we're going to need more than geography to keep you safe." That evening, as they sat around Samuel's kitchen table sharing their first hot meal in over a week, the old rancher outlined a plan that was both simple and audacious. Rather than simply hiding Maria away and hoping Carlisle would eventually give up his pursuit, Samuel proposed they take the fight directly to their enemy. "You see," Samuel explained, leaning back in his wooden chair, "I've been living in these mountains for 30 years, and I've learned a thing or two about dealing with men who think they can take whatever they want. The key is to make yourself more trouble than you're worth." Samuel had contacts throughout the territory, other ranchers, miners, and even some lawmen who weren't corrupted by money and influence. More importantly, He knew the location of a federal marshal named Thomas Wright, who had been working to build cases against human trafficking operations throughout the Western Territories. "Wright's been after men like this, Carlisle, for years," Samuel said. "The problem is that these criminals are usually too smart to leave evidence behind, and their victims are too scared to testify against them. But if we can give Wright what he needs to build a solid case, we might be able to put this Carlisle behind bars permanently." The plan required Maria to do something that terrified her: testify about her experiences and provide detailed information about Carlisle's operation. It would mean reliving traumatic memories and potentially putting herself at risk if the case fell apart. But it also offered something she had never dared to hope for: the possibility of true justice and the chance to prevent other girls from suffering as she had. "I'll do it," Maria said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear Jake could see in her eyes. "If there's a chance to stop him from hurting other girls, I have to try." Jake felt a surge of admiration for her courage, but he also worried about the dangers involved. Testifying against Carlisle would make Maria a target not just for the man himself, but for all his associates and corrupted officials who profited from his criminal enterprise. "There's more," Samuel continued. "Wright's been trying to coordinate with authorities in Texas and New Mexico to hit multiple locations simultaneously. If we can time this right, we might be able to take down Carlisle's entire network in one operation." Over the next 3 days, Samuel made contact with Marshal Wright and arranged a secret meeting in the small mountain town of Pine Ridge, about 15 miles from the ranch. Wright turned out to be exactly the kind of man Jake had hoped: honest, competent, and absolutely committed to bringing criminals like Carlisle to justice. Wright listened intently as Maria described her experiences, taking careful notes and asking detailed questions about locations, names, and the operation's structure. His respectful manner and obvious dedication to his work helped Maria open up about details she had never spoken aloud before. "This is exactly what I need," Wright told them after Maria finished her testimony. "With this information, I can coordinate raids on 3 different locations where Carlisle keeps girls, and I can issue warrants for at least a dozen men in his organization." But Wright also delivered sobering news about the immediate danger they faced. Carlisle had indeed followed their trail into Colorado and was currently camped just 20 miles south with a group of hired gunmen. The man was no longer simply pursuing a single escaped girl. He was treating this as a war against anyone who dared to interfere with his business. "He's made this personal," Wright explained. "Word is that he's put out a significant bounty on both of your heads. He wants to make an example of you to discourage others from helping his victims escape." Jake felt his stomach tighten as he realized the full implications of Wright's words. They had succeeded in reaching safety, but Carlisle wasn't going to give up. The man was prepared to escalate the conflict to levels that put not just Jake and Maria at risk, but Samuel and anyone else who tried to help them. "When can you make your arrests?" Jake asked. "I need another week to coordinate with the other jurisdictions," Wright replied. "But I'm worried that Carlisle won't wait that long. If he decides to attack your uncle's ranch with the men he's brought, you'll be badly outnumbered." Samuel leaned forward, his expression grim but determined. "Then we'd better make sure we're ready for him." What followed was the most intense week of Jake's life. Samuel called in favors from neighbors and friends throughout the valley, men who had lived through range wars and Indian conflicts and knew how to handle themselves in a fight. By the end of the week, they had assembled a force of 12 experienced fighters who were willing to stand against Carlisle and his hired guns. The ranch was transformed into a fortress, with strategic positions prepared throughout the valley and careful plans made for defending against an attack from any direction. Maria proved to have an unexpected talent for planning defensive strategies, drawing on intelligence she had gathered about Carlisle's methods and the types of men he employed. The attack came on a moonless night, just as Samuel had predicted it would. Carlisle and 8 gunmen approached the ranch from 3 different directions, clearly intending to overwhelm the defenders through superior numbers and the element of surprise. But Jake and his allies were ready for them. The battle that followed was brief but intense, with gunfire echoing off the surrounding mountains as the 2 forces clashed in the darkness. Jake found himself in the position he had always dreaded, but somehow known was inevitable, facing Vincent Carlisle directly in single combat. The man was every bit as dangerous as Jake had imagined, quick with his gun and absolutely ruthless in his determination to reclaim what he saw as his property. But Jake fought with something Carlisle couldn't understand. Not just the desire to protect Maria, but a deep love that had grown between them during their long journey together. When the shooting stopped and the smoke cleared, Carlisle lay dead in the dirt of Samuel's ranch yard, and 3 of his men had been captured alive. The others had fled into the darkness, their leader's death having broken their will to continue the fight. Marshal Wright arrived the next morning with a full posse and warrants for everyone in Carlisle's organization. The coordinated raids he had planned were carried out successfully, resulting in the liberation of 17 young women and the arrest of over 30 criminals across 3 states. Maria's testimony proved to be the key evidence that broke open the entire network, leading to convictions that sent corrupt officials to prison alongside the criminals they had protected. The girl who had once been bought and sold like livestock became the instrument of justice that destroyed one of the largest human trafficking operations in the Western Territories. In the month that followed, Jake and Maria made a new life together in the mountains of Colorado. Samuel deeded them a section of his ranch where they'd built their own cabin and began raising horses just as Jake had always dreamed of doing. Maria fulfilled her own dream of becoming a teacher, establishing a school for the children of local ranchers and miners. They married in the spring, surrounded by friends who had stood with them during the darkest moments of their struggle. Samuel officiated the ceremony, and Marshal Wright traveled all the way from Denver to serve as Jake's best man, calling him one of the bravest men he had ever had the privilege to know. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Maria's parents arrived from Mexico for the wedding, having finally saved enough money to travel north and see their daughter again. The reunion was tearful and joyous, a reminder that the love Maria had found with Jake hadn't replaced the family bonds that Carlisle had tried to destroy, but had instead made it possible for those bonds to be renewed and strengthened. Years later, when people asked Jake about his decision to help Maria escape, he would always say that he had simply done what any decent man would do when faced with injustice. But those who knew the full story understood that his actions had required a special kind of courage. Not just the bravery to face physical danger, but the wisdom to recognize that some things are worth risking everything to protect. Maria often told their children that their father was a true cowboy in the finest sense of that word, not because he could ride and shoot and work with cattle, but because he had lived by a code of honor that put protecting the innocent above his own safety and comfort. She had been sold like property, but Jake had proven that no amount of money could purchase a human soul, and no criminal enterprise could stand forever against people willing to fight for what was right. The ranch they built together became a place of refuge for others who needed help, and their story became legend throughout the mountain country. It was said that no one who truly needed assistance was ever turned away from the Martinez Ranch, and that Jake and Maria had created something beautiful and lasting from the ashes of their shared ordeal. In the end, Jake had kept his promise to save Maria, but in the process, he discovered that she had saved him as well. From a life of comfortable complacency, from never knowing the depth of love he was capable of feeling, and from missing the chance to be part of something larger and more meaningful than himself. Their love story had begun with violence and fear, but it grew into something that embodied the best qualities of the American frontier: courage, justice, and the unshakable belief that every person deserved the chance to live free and pursue their own dreams. It was a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, ordinary people could choose to do extraordinary things, and that love, when combined with determination and courage, had the power to overcome any obstacle.